Hi, we are glad you could join us today for our ECG Establishing Commercial Reasonableness panel discussion. I am Allison Pullins, Vice President of Product, and I am pleased to be your moderator for today's program. In this webinar, we will review and discuss tips and tricks for establishing commercial reasonableness and best practices from commercial reasonableness assessments. This discussion today will be in panel format. Now, before we begin the formal program, let's go over a few details about our webinar. Today's webinar will be about 60 minutes in length, which will include about 45 minutes of discussion and about 10 minutes of audience Q&A at the end. If you'd like a copy of the handout we'll be using today, you can download it from the handout panel on your screen. Attendees are participating in listen-only mode, but if you have questions, you can type them into the questions pane on your screen at any time, and we will address them at the end of our discussion. We will be launching a few audience polling questions today, and we'll hope that you'll consider participating. And finally, upon exiting today's webinar, you will be directed to an electronic survey. Your feedback is important to us, so please take a minute to complete the survey. For every completed survey, ECG will make a $5 donation to Doctors Without Borders. Now, let's meet today's speakers. Kate Taylor provides compensation, business valuation, and other related consulting services to healthcare clients and a variety of business organizations. Her primary areas of expertise include finance, due diligence, valuation, and compensation design. Kate delivers the reliable valuation opinions and advice clients need to make well-informed decisions. She believes in responsiveness and accessibility and fosters open, clear communication in every aspect of her work. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Allison. It's great to be here today.
Also speaking today, I'm pleased to introduce Jake Pucklop. Jake works on a wide array of fair market value and commercial reasonableness assessments of business enterprise valuations and physician compensation arrangements for clinical, administrative, and ED call coverage services. His analytical background enables him to conduct studies that provide clients with unique and innovative answers to complex valuation topics and achieve fair and defensible agreements. Welcome, Jake.
Thanks, Allison. Excited to be here today.
Okay, let's dive in. So, Jake, the first question is for you. I'd love to start off by telling our participants why establishing and documenting commercial reasonableness matters.
Thanks, Allison. I think the first thing to consider is the financial risk that organizations are facing. There was almost $2 billion in 2023 recoveries, and that was the most settlements and highest amount in history. And for every dollar that the government invests in this, they're getting $4 to $5 in return. So we really think this is going to be a continued area of focus. And then fundamentally, from an organizational perspective, treble damages presents kind of a material significant risk that can put patient care and the ability to provide solid patient care at risk. And that's, at the end of the day, what we're all focused on here. And finally, in my mind, I think it's a lot easier for employees to understand commercial reasonableness than fair market value. Fair market value can be fairly technical. There's a lot of numbers that go into it. But commercial reasonableness, there's a lot of employees that can just look at an arrangement and say, this doesn't really make sense. And that increases the number of relators and the risk to an organization.
Thanks, Jake. With that, we are going to be initiating our first poll. That should be appearing on your screen right now. The poll is, does your organization document commercial reasonableness for every provider transaction? And we would like for you to select one of the following. Yes, always. The second option is yes, but not consistently. The third is no, we don't. And the last is unsure. Now, I want to ensure the audience that these are confidential responses. So we would love to see which ones that you have selected. Okay, great. That was a very fast response to the poll. Thank you all so much. As you can see from the results on the screen, we have a compliant group here with 44% can always documenting commercial reasonableness and almost 20% consistently documenting. Panelists, I'd love to hear your reaction. Kate, what do you take of these results?
Yeah, I thought the word document in the polling question was important here. I've seen several clients who internally evaluate commercial reasonableness, meaning it's simply an email or hallway conversation, but no actual documentation on record. So I'm pleased with these responses that the majority of those in the presentation are always documenting commercial reasonableness.
Jake, do you have any thoughts to add?
No, just echoing Kate, and of course happy to see that yes always and yes but not consistently are at the top.
Sure. Okay, let's close that out and continue on with our questions. So obviously, federal regulations play a huge role in the topic of commercial reasonableness. So tell us, Kate, how do recent updates to the Stark Law and the anti-kickback statute impact the assessment of commercial reasonableness for physician arrangements?
I think this is a great question and likely why we're talking about this so heavily today. But as you're alluding to, the Stark laws were officially modernized by CMS and the OIG in early 2021. But up until that point, the definition for commercial reasonableness was historically not explicitly defined. And usually I don't like to read a definition on a webinar, but in this case, I think the definition of commercial reasonableness is important to this discussion. So I am going to read it today. Commercially reasonable was clarified to mean, quote, that the particular arrangement furthers a legitimate business purpose of the parties to the arrangement and is sensible considering the characteristics of the parties, including their size, type, scope, and specialty. An arrangement may be commercially reasonable even if it does not result in profit for one or more of the parties. So to answer your question, Allison, the fact that this is now codified makes an impact in and of itself. However, the last sentence of this definition also adds an element of significance in the evaluation of commercial reasonableness. Specifically, that last sentence in this definition is stating that the fact that an arrangement results in a loss for one or more of the parties does not by itself determine whether it is commercially reasonable. That said, and I think Jake would agree with me on this, while an arrangement does not need to be profitable to be commercially reasonable, we would highly recommend that organizations still evaluate the rationale of the projected profit or loss of the arrangement internally.
I am sure we will be talking about profitability or lack thereof later on in our discussion. Next question is for Jake. Jake, from your perspective, what roles do market data and industry benchmarks play in validating the commercial reasonableness of physician transactions?
Yeah, definitely. Fair market value is an important component of our commercial reasonableness process, and market benchmarks really make up the bulk of that analysis. Generally speaking, it's always going to be more straightforward to support an arrangement from a commercially reasonableness standpoint that fits well within market benchmarks. After all, as an organization, you're paying, the going rate for a service is probably in line with what competitors and other similar entities are paying nationwide for that service. It's when your services don't fit as well within the market benchmarks that it really becomes important to do a good job of documenting those services and including, in your opinion, kind of a detailed response to why those aren't fitting in the kind of central tendency of the market data.
Got it. Kate, do you have anything you'd like to add to Jake's remarks?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Jake. Market data obviously plays a critical role in validating commercial reasonableness of physician contracts. And importantly, using market data helps protect organizations from legal and costly financial penalties by ensuring that the terms of a contract are transparent and defensible, of course, against legal challenges. But I did want to make one clarification to Jake's commentary. Market data is also used in evaluating areas of the arrangement outside of compensation. So for example, we may use market data to determine how many providers of a particular specialty are available to provide services in the service area, or even evaluate alternative providers for the arrangement. So market data and industry benchmarks doesn't always have to simply refer to compensation data.
That's an excellent point. You know, we have a metric in MD Ranger that tells users what percentage of the people in our database are paying for a service in the first place. So this is an additional industry benchmark that can be used for commercial reasonableness documentation. Okay, so with that, we'd love to initiate our second polling question, and that should appear on your screen now. Wonderful. So the question is, does your organization routinely use market data and industry benchmarks to validate their physician contracts? And we would love for the audience to select one. Yes, you're always using market data. You're not, you are using market data, but not as consistently. You aren't currently integrating market data into your commercial reasonableness assessments and your FMV determination, or you're unsure if you do. You know, this is an important question for us to consider in the context of this webinar. ECG as a firm is extremely data driven, and the majority of clients we work with are using market data for these types of assessments and just for general market intelligence. Okay, so let's go ahead and release that poll. Wow, we do have a lot of data-driven organizations on the phone today. Kate and Jake, I would love to hear your response to our poll with overwhelmingly participants selecting yes, always.
This doesn't surprise me. What I think would be more interesting to figure out and dig into these poll responses is how these benchmark data is integrated into their governance framework. So how are they selecting benchmark data as an organization? Who evaluates that benchmark data, et cetera?
That's such a good point. Jake, anything else to add?
Yep, I agree. I also think it'd be interesting just to see as we dig deeper in what type of data organizations are using, whether it's all compensation or if they're looking at some other data like physician needs and other things along those lines.
Great. Okay, let's close out that poll and jump right back in. Jake, do you think you could share with our participants how should hospitals be preparing for potential regulatory audits or investigations concerning commercial reasonableness of their physician arrangements?
Yeah, I think this is definitely an area where prevention is a very key aspect. It's always going to be important for organizations to prepare proactively and be prepared for the possibility of this happening. And if you do prepare in that manner, if it does get to that point, you're going to be in a much better situation. So that starts with fostering a strong firm-wide culture of compliance, having compensation administration and strategy personnel thinking about commercial reasonableness and documenting it as they go and thinking about whether their arrangements make sense as they're pursuing them. That's always going to be a good place to start. Another thing we see a lot in government filings is a bad fact pattern. So we'll see, emails between people talking about how valuable a certain doctor's referrals might be, or if we get this doctor, there's going to be a ton of downstream revenues, so we don't need to consider how much we're paying for him, and things like that put a lot of risk on an organization and present a bad fact pattern. I know we often think about not putting anything in text that you wouldn't be comfortable having blown up in a courtroom. And I think a lot of organizations that could be very beneficial to always keep that in mind.
Absolutely. Texts and emails are forever, as they say. Okay, so Kate, next question. Tell us how you differentiate between commercial reasonableness and fair market value, or FMV, in physician contracts, and what are some of the common pitfalls when attempting to meet both standards?
Sure. When assessing qualitative factors such as strategic and operational benefits, commercial reasonableness takes into account the overall terms of the arrangement and asks the question, does this deal even make sense, even if no consideration is given to the volume or value of referrals? So, in other words, commercial reasonableness evaluations are more broad in scope and consider the deal in its entirety. But it's worth noting that fair market value is a key component in determining commercial reasonableness, because the financial terms, as Jake said earlier, are just one part of the overall contract. However, the entire arrangement must be evaluated to ensure the transaction is actually commercially reasonable. And because we're reviewing the entire contract for commercial reasonableness, if an arrangement is not commercially reasonable, no matter of compensation may become irrelevant. So in other words, if a financial arrangement is deemed commercially unreasonable, there may be no need to establish fair market value at all. And to answer your second question, I would say common pitfalls for fair market value would be not considering all of the individual facts and circumstances of the arrangement, such as market dynamics, expertise of the providers, special qualifications of the provider. The list of things that you can consider in a fair market valuation is honestly exhaustive, but having those conversations with your evaluator and with the client is going to be your key to success there. And related to common pitfalls for determining commercial reasonableness, I would say number one is lack of documentation. And you'll hear Jake and I say this several times throughout this webinar, but there are multiple commercial reasonableness checklists available out there that assist in ensuring that you have the answers to the questions to support your commercial reasonableness assessment. So in fact, we actually have one in our commercial reasonableness toolkit at ECG. So we would recommend relying on those checklists to ensure you've answered all the necessary questions and that your arrangement is in fact commercially reasonable.
So helpful, Kate. And the listeners may be wondering, how can we get our hands on this toolkit? Rest assured, everybody will get a copy of the toolkit that includes that checklist following our panel discussion today. Okay, so profitability. I would like to go back to this question around it and commercial reasonableness. So Jake, could you explain how a physician arrangement could be deemed commercially reasonable even if it's not profitable?
Yeah, definitely. In 2021, CMS formally clarified their standard that an arrangement doesn't have to be profitable to be commercially reasonable. And there's a lot of arrangements that we see very commonly that aren't going to be profitable for a hospital that are commercially reasonable. Some examples might be rural call coverage services that don't have a ton of volume, a lot of coverage-based specialties, similar things to that nature. When you dig into the compensation data as well, there's a lot of specialties that have compensation to collections ratios above 1, even at the median. So there's a lot of specialties out there that hospitals might not be turning a profit on that are still definitely commercially reasonable to engage with. Also, there's times that we see arrangements that may be expected to turn a profit, but can't because of organizational challenges, whether it's inefficiencies or poor payer mix, similar things to that. And those also might be commercially reasonable, but it's just important to have an open dialogue with the healthcare entity so that you can document all of those challenges in the commercial reasonableness opinion.
That's great. And I just building on this question because it's such a key point for our listeners today. Kate, do you think you could share a few scenarios where physician arrangements result in economic losses and what strategies hospitals should be using to justify commercial reasonableness beyond financial metrics?
Many arrangements that Jake and I evaluate have provisions in their contracts that indicate the provider has to treat all patients regardless of their ability to pay. So depending on the payer mix demographics of that patient population, this could result in a very unfavorable collection performance and further a loss on the arrangement. So to document these facts, the organization should ask themselves questions about why these losses are occurring. So For example, is there a significant demand for these services? And that's important for why you enter into the arrangement regardless. Additionally, if the arrangement didn't exist, would the patient otherwise have to travel several hundred miles to receive the care? Is there a shortage of providers of this specialty in the service area of the facility? So be prepared to document all of these facts and circumstances. And as Jake said, have that dialogue within the organization to make sure that you can tell the story as to why that arrangement is needed despite the loss that's occurring.
Okay, so related to provider shortages, how can hospitals effectively demonstrate community need for physician services, particularly when they are providing a specialty service in a remote or underserved area? Kate, maybe you could take that.
Sure, I really like this question because candidly, the qualitative part of evaluation and a commercial reasonableness assessment is really exciting for me because you actually get the details behind an arrangement and why it's needed in the community. But there's several different ways that I evaluate this, but I can think of a few different examples to list here. First, I would recommend referring to your physician needs assessment. This is a strategic analysis that's conducted by a healthcare organization to determine the need for additional physicians in a particular specialty or geographic area. And this process ensures that the organization has the appropriate number and types of physicians to meet the healthcare needs of those in the community. In fact, ECG actually has a team of experts who can help prepare a physician needs assessment for your organization, and we lean on them internally as well to help build that story behind the evaluation and CR assessment. Secondly, there's many surveys that are available that cite supply and demand issues of a particular specialty. So those are always helpful as well. One caveat though is that those surveys often speak to a particular specialty from a national perspective and not always from a regional perspective. So given that, I always try to supplement that detail with information on designated shortage area that's actually reported by HRSA. This is a fantastic tool that helps you evaluate whether that organization is sitting in a location that actually faces a shortage of different healthcare services.
Great, thanks, Kate. So Jake, when you perform a commercial reasonableness assessment for one of your clients, could you tell us more about what that process looks like?
Yeah, Kate touched on this a little bit, but it's going to start with sending a questionnaire or a list of questions to the client because they ultimately are the ones that are going to best understand the services that are being provided and why they make sense for the organization. A lot of times I find it's very helpful to have a conversation with the client once they have that questionnaire filled out or in lieu of filling it out, just because it's a lot easier to have an open discussion that way than over email. Follow-up questions flow a lot more smoothly, and it's just easier to get your arms around the arrangement and how exactly it's meeting the client's needs. Sometimes we do run into clients reaching out for a fair market value and commercial reasonableness opinion that kind of get tripped up by the CR aspect and might not have thought about it yet. And in those times, it's really a good sign that the client needs to do a little more thinking about the strategic impact of the arrangement and why it makes sense for them. And we're happy to help facilitate those calls as well, but just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and it's been thought about.
You know, that's a really good point to add, Jake. So, you know, at ECG, we consistently hear from our clients that aligning compensation philosophy with regulatory requirements presents challenges, to say the very least. So, Kate, would love to hear your thoughts on how do you ensure that physician compensation models align with commercial reasonableness standards? And are there any best practices you can share with our listeners in this area?
Sure. The first element of addressing this item is having a firm understanding of commercial reasonableness. As we've talked about already, it can be somewhat subjective, so it's really important that you have that process understood. And you can't be certain that your models align with commercial reasonableness if you don't have a process in place to evaluate commercial reasonableness. So outside of this process and understanding, best practice would be to ensure that your compensation models are in alignment with the mission and goals of the organization and facilitate achievement of that mission and those goals. Secondly, I would highly recommend that each arrangement be evaluated by legal counsel, either internally or externally, to ensure that all factors that are necessary to support that commercial reasonableness of that arrangement have actually been considered. For example, you would want your legal team to ensure there are well-defined and objective measures of performance and an evaluation process for that performance embedded in the arrangement, and that there's no vague terms that are inconsistent with other arrangements in your organization. Another example would be ensuring there is a defined payment amount with a defined maximum payout included in that arrangement.
You know, I'm hearing a lot of standardization and consistency emerging as patterns when we're talking about best practices here. But just to follow up with a related question, what are the best practices for hospitals to document commercial reasonableness of arrangements? Particularly, I'd love you to touch on complex arrangements that may not conform to typical standards.
I know I sound like a broken record. I think I've said this 6 times now by my count, but having legal counsel review the arrangement. Additionally, if it is a complex arrangement that's unique from any other arrangement in your organization, I would recommend having a commercial reasonableness opinion by a professional evaluation firm like ECG. As Jake alluded to, we can help facilitate that process and make sure you're asking the right questions. I would also advise initiating a contract review with an assessment of CR before considering fair market value in these particular circumstances of those complex arrangements.
Thanks, Kate. Okay, I would like to turn to Jake to ask him about the most common mistakes that you're seeing both healthcare organizations and valuation firms make when it comes to establishing and documenting commercial reasonableness. Tell us, Jake, what they, in your opinion, what they are and how could they potentially be avoided?
Yeah, I think there's 3 main issues that I come across a lot. First of all is treating commercial reasonableness as an afterthought and just focusing on the fair market value component. I think we touched on that kind of at the beginning, that fair market value can be straightforward, quantitative, but it's important not to treat commercial reasonableness just as an afterthought or a checkbox activity. I think second is having a transactional relationship with your FMV and CR firm. I think a lot of, or sometimes organizations will get into a situation where they just provide a couple pieces of data and expect a FMV and CR opinion, and in those cases, your CR opinion might not be as detailed as it would be if you have that open dialogue. And I also think as you kind of grow with your relationship with your fair market value firm, as they're more of a trusted advisor, it's a lot easier to have those conversations and for them to be in a position to push back when necessary. And then third, I think I kind of touched on this in my previous answer, but it's not providing enough information to fully document the commercial reasonableness. Ultimately, the organization is going to be the one that can best provide information on commercial reasonableness. We can look at market data, even some regional data, but that data is never going to as best capture the arrangement as the people who are working on it every day can. So really getting that information from people who are putting it into place, who intimately know what an organization is going through, really helps strengthen the CR opinion, and is something that I think some firms are missing.
Allison, I'll add to that I think one of the best parts of our day is when we issue a commercial reasonableness questionnaire and it gets returned and completed and there's no follow-up questions needed. So that would be a dream in Jake and I's world.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking myself, I work with a number of compliance and legal teams that use MD Ranger, and really the kind of the best practice organizations are really involving their business teams and their service line leaders on completing those commercial reasonableness checklists, because as a compliance professional, you may not know the business reasons or the clinical reasons for why this position needs to be justified. So, you know, working across silos, working across teams, communicating across your organization, it's really a team effort to document commercial reasonableness. Okay, so I want to move into our third and final poll today. If we could get that initiated, please. Again, we would love everybody's participation here. The question is, has your internal process for documenting commercial reasonableness ever resulted in a negative finding for a proposed arrangement? So you could not justify the commercial reasonableness. We would love for you to select one answer. Yes, this frequently happens at our organization. Second, it may occasionally happen. The third response is that no, this very rarely happens at our organization. And the last is that it never happens. It would be great if everybody could participate. When we were thinking of polling questions, we were very curious at how this would turn out. Okay, I think we're going to wrap up the poll now. Let's take a look at those responses. So 62% say that it rarely happens at their organizations, 23% never, and 15% occasionally. Okay, this is interesting. Jake, do you have any thoughts on the results of this poll that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think if a lot of people said frequently, that would definitely be concerning. But I think this is pointing in the right direction. But obviously, if an entity is never getting adverse findings, either they're doing stuff right every time, which is possible in best case, or they might need to be a little bit more stringent. So either is possible.
Kate, do you have any follow-up thoughts to that?
Totally agree with Jake. I also think, the fact that there's occasionally and rarely is evidence that this process internally is probably working. But yeah, it is totally possible that there's never a negative finding for commercial reasonableness. And I do hope that it's because there are such strong commercial reasonableness frameworks internally.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and close that poll. Thank you so much. So the next question, I would love for you both to answer if you could. I'd like you to elaborate on some of the high risk circumstances in transactions, like low frequency call coverage, or maybe a physician with multiple directorships. How might those circumstances be addressed proactively while still documenting commercial reasonableness? And maybe Kate, you could kick us off.
Sure. For call coverage, there are several examples that we would recommend reviewing and documenting carefully with respect to necessity and commercial reasonableness. Candidly, it's low-hanging fruit. First, call coverage services with very low burden. For example, dermatology as one specialty. An organization should be prepared to document why they are wanting to pay a dermatologist for the provision of this call coverage if the burden is extremely low and the physician is rarely paid. And if it does have a high burden, for whatever reason, be prepared to tell that story before you enter into that arrangement. Second example, I would say call coverage arrangements for multiple campuses that are close in proximity, especially if the emergency departments of both campuses are fairly low volume. Again, be prepared to tell the story as to why the arrangement is necessary if the burden is so low and the campuses are so close together. Jake, did you want to speak to the medical directorship piece of that?
Yeah, definitely. There's certainly times where medical directorships that might be higher risk on paper make sense. Either a physician that is working multiple medical directorships or multiple medical directorships within the same specialty umbrella. So perhaps for an example, you have a neurosurgery medical director and then also a medical director of thrombectomy. And that might make sense for your organization because each physician is bringing different skill sets to the table. One that might need to dedicate more time, program building, any of that sort of thing. But it's just important to, when you're getting into those arrangements that might be a little bit higher risk on paper, to think about that at the onset and document why it best works for your organization.
Allison, I'd like to add to that, just like there is a physician needs assessment, there's an analysis you can do called a medical directorship needs assessment. where an organization lays out their medical directorships across the organization to determine if any of them are duplicative. Are any of these services being performed already by a different physician? And which of these medical directorship services are truly necessary because of a certification, for example? So that might be a helpful tip for the audience if they have any concerns about that from an administrative perspective.
That's a great best practice, Kate. Do you see many organizations routinely performing those types of assessments, or do you think this is an area of opportunity for folks?
I think it's both. I mean, especially for those larger organizations with multiple campuses, I think that's where it can get a little convoluted, right? You might have the same medical directorship, but it's because they're on two different hospital campuses. But you still need to make sure that it makes sense that you have two physicians effectively providing the same service. So yeah, to answer your question, I think it'd be beneficial for both.
I'd love to get into a little more specifics because I feel like some of these high risk scenarios are best illustrated with an example. So Kate, do you think you could maybe tell us, a call coverage scenario that maybe you've encountered out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give some details without giving away any names or anything, but let's assume that you have a level 2 trauma center that maintains neurosurgery coverage through a contract with a panel of several different neurosurgeons. And let's also assume these neurosurgeons have privileges that include spinal surgery. The contract requires the on-call physician to be restricted for the entire 24-hour period. So that means that they must remain on site and are, of course, precluded from doing any sort of non-emergency work during that time. But let's also assume the neurosurgery contract provides for first and second call due to the trauma certification of the hospital. So there are several then neurosurgeons that are available to provide this service. So if there were, let's say, a panel of orthopedic surgeons that also specialize in spine surgery, which is common with this specialty, and that requested the hospital to create an on-call panel for only spine cases, that might not necessarily meet the standard for commercial reasonableness because, again, you have a restricted coverage panel that's being provided by several different neurosurgeons, and there's a second call for that panel as well. So you want to ask yourself, is the volume for spinal surgery really significant enough that it requires a whole other call panel in the form of orthopedic surgery for that hospital? So you'd have to assess both panels in totality before you can truly answer that commercial reasonableness question.
Yeah, I can see how this could get complicated. And of course, you've got physicians and groups to deal with and negotiate as well. So Jake, do you think you could maybe give us a similar example for medical directorships that may be more challenging?
Yeah, I think kind of perhaps an extreme example would be a medical director that is making a significant amount of money, say, several $100,000, and don't have a lot of duties to go along with that. Maybe they have nominal duties, maybe their duties aren't really spelled out, so it's kind of as they see fit, but they're making a lot of money for the role. There's no measurable outcomes for the physician, nothing that they're directly required to improve to get that payment. And there's going to be several issues with that, right? So there's excessive compensation for a medical directorship, excessive compensation without doing anything to earn that money. There's insufficient responsibilities relative to the payment, and ultimately, evaluator or even worse, the government would be asking why that arrangement would be compensated if not for the referrals. So I think that's a good example of something that I think a lot of people, hopefully on the phone, would say, that sounds ridiculous. We would never do that. But then it comes up in government filings that people are doing that.
And Jake and I actually are part of a team in ECG that performed a pretty comprehensive analysis on all of the cases, significant cases over the last several years, and medical directorship popped up in nearly all of them. So clearly this is an issue and a red flag for the government. So again, as Jake said, it seems like, oh, this is obvious. We would never do that, but it obviously happens quite a bit with several reputable healthcare organizations.
I don't think we've actually mentioned time tracking for administrative roles during this discussion, and I just wanted to highlight the importance importance of that, particularly in these situations where you've got, high payments to a medical director. That time tracking piece is really critical.
I totally agree, Allison. And I think just like physicians, I don't think necessarily like to record their time. I also am not a fan of putting in my time every single day. But there are other ways I think physicians can meet that need that we've worked through with organizations, such as performance metrics that are evaluated each quarter. So as opposed to, documenting each hour the person is performing that service, there could be clearly defined and delineated metrics that the physician is supposed to achieve under that role and could be evaluated regularly. So that to me is a sort of a medium in terms of that frustration with the documented.
That's an excellent point. Jake, with the growing prevalence and popularity of telemedicine, could you tell us how commercial reasonableness applies to contracts that include virtual services, and if there are any new or unique challenges that these types of arrangements pose?
Yeah, definitely. And we've definitely seen an increase in telemedicine type arrangements, especially post-pandemic. And a lot of times they are the best way for an organization to meet their needs. In rural areas and areas with a large patient catchment, you might be able to have one doctor see a lot of patients that wouldn't be able to get care otherwise. So when thinking about telemedicine from a commercial reasonableness perspective, we're always thinking of ways to document how this best meets an organization's needs. So that's just going in and documenting why this provider and this type of service is going to best meet the needs of the patients, and then building on that, how success is going to be measured and how the provider is going to be evaluated, and making sure that they're tracking either how often the provider is available, how many patients they're seeing, productivity, all of those types of similar metrics, so that everybody can ensure that the patient's needs are being met and the organization's needs are being met.
What do you think, Kate?
I agree completely. I can think of one example that Jake was talking about briefly, but we see this a lot in rural hospital settings where they lack a particular specialty locally. Particularly neurology and psychiatry are two big ones that we've seen a lot this year. But it's likely commercially reasonable for a hospital to have those telemedicine arrangements because it's a legitimate need. They don't have those services. However, if that hospital then contracts with a telemedicine provider for the services, but already has those in-house in the form of employed physicians or a PSA or something of that nature, that may be seen as unnecessary and commercially unreasonable. Again, not to say definitively, you're going to have to do the background detail to make sure that there truly is a reason. Maybe those employed physicians are just overloaded. As Jake said, you need to take a look at their productivity and see, are they truly working at the 90th percentile, and that's why we need that telemedicine arrangement. So just be prepared to ask those questions and work through those issues.
That's great. Thank you, Kate. So we've talked quite a bit about the commercial reasonableness of provider arrangements, but I'd like to just take a minute to focus on healthcare business transactions. Jake, do you think you could speak to how commercial reasonableness impacts healthcare transactions?
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit of a different process on a transaction basis. On transactions, the fair market value much more significantly drives the commercial reasonableness of the arrangement. It's generally reasonable for an organization to acquire the value of positive cash flows or the value of assets. But the flip side of that is that it makes the fair market value process much more important, and important to make sure that you're accurately valuing the entity that's going to be acquired. A lot of times in transaction work, we'll hear maybe doctors that own practice say, the real value of this practice is the downstream referrals, or we hear that in urgent care a lot. And if you have a fair market value that includes those referrals, and then you're paying based on that, then that wouldn't be a commercially reasonable payment. So in that sense, from a transaction perspective, the fair market value is a little bit more of the focal point, but ensuring that it's accurately capturing cash flows or the value of the assets is really the important part.
Thanks, Jake. From your perspective, Kate, what are the most important criteria to establishing commercial reasonableness?
Well, let me start by saying that each criteria should be evaluated, and as we've alluded to, there are several that should be. Some of these criteria include alignment with mission and goals. We talked about that earlier. Frequency and intensity of the need for the service, alternatives to the arrangement. So are there other providers in the area that could provide the service? Duplication of the arrangement, financial performance, all those are elements that should be considered. But I would say that when I perform a commercial reasonableness assessment, the first item I assess is whether the business purpose actually aligns with the organization's mission. I believe this sets the tone for the rest of the assessment. If the arrangement doesn't align with and facilitate the achievement of the organization's mission, stop there, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Jake, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree, but I do think that's something that a lot of people kind of view separately as the organization's mission and an individual arrangement. So it's always important to take that into account and make sure that the arrangement you're looking at really helps push the organization's mission forward.
Okay. So one last question before we go to audience Q&A. So audience, if you have questions, don't forget to type them into your question panel. So what are, and I'd like to ask Kate this one, what are some non-standard justifications for why a physician arrangement may be considered commercially reasonable? And do you have any documentation tips for these non-standard justifications?
I really like this question because CMS and the OIG have indicated before that there are circumstances that could result in a commercially reasonable event, but don't necessarily otherwise meet the standard criteria. And I can think of a few examples of this. The first of which is a documented community need for the service, or if there is an insufficient local or regional resources to address that community need. A second example I can think of would be cost reduction. So can we get a comparable services with equal or better quality for less dollars? Locums is a great example of this, right? Locum tenens are typically short-term fixes to supply shortages. And so if we can actually find a provider that can come and provide these services at a more affordable price than a locum tenens, then that should be a dead giveaway that we should proceed with that arrangement. A third example would be simply meeting regulatory requirements to provide basic coverage like anesthesia within the organization.
Jake, before we turn to the audience, anything else you would want to add to Kate's response?
Yeah, I think there's two things I want to touch on here. One is profit and loss, which we talked about a little bit at the onset. While it's not the defining feature anymore, I think it is important to consider whether an arrangement is going to cause an organization and a loss into perpetuity, and make sure that that still makes sense. And then second, I just want to echo what Kate said about locum arrangements. A lot of times in commercial reasonableness opinions, we'll consider alternatives, and the only alternative might be locums. And in a lot of circumstances, it'll be better for an organization to pay even above a typical market rate to avoid locums, both for a financial perspective and for the added integration you get when contracting with a non-locum provider. So I think that's another one that's always interesting to consider.
Before we go on to audience questions, I just want to thank the both of you for participating today and being the experts on the panel. I love being your colleague, and this was so informative and interesting. We do have a couple of audience questions that I want to throw out to y'all. The first one is, can you provide any real-life examples of cases that settled that involved commercial reasonableness?
I can take that one, Jake. One that immediately comes to mind for me is a case that was settled in 2014 that everyone on the call is probably aware of, Halifax. This case actually involves certain employment compensation arrangements between medical oncologists and a few neurosurgeons at Halifax Hospital. And the compliance officer at the hospital actually filed the qui tam action, alleging that the agreements were in excess of fair market value, but also not commercially reasonable. According to the government's expert witness, several factors led them to believe that the commercial reasonableness of the transactions did not exist. A few things that they noted was that the physician's contracts actually contained unreasonably vague terms, that they were not definitive or explicit, and that there was even a clause stating that the physicians could receive, quote, any other reasonable compensation from time to time. So it goes without saying that this is not best practice, but that's one case in particular. But I can tell you just from our recent review of those regulatory arrangements and cases that there have been several where commercial reasonableness has been cited.
Jay, you have anything you want to throw on there?
Yeah, I think another good one similarly is the Toomey case, which focused on part-time arrangements with physicians, and those arrangements had pretty open-ended terms. There weren't defined hours they were working. They were 10-year terms, which is another not ideal situation, to put it mildly. And ultimately, it was contracts that were just aimed at getting the doctors more money to protect referrals. So yeah, I think that's another good one that just wouldn't pass muster from a commercial reasonableness perspective.
Yeah. Understood. Okay, so I've got another regulatory slash recovery question here. Said you mentioned earlier that recoveries in 2023 totaled almost $2 billion. How does that compare to prior years? And were there any particular specialties or services that were more prominent in those cases? So were there any trends, this person is asking?
I think the trend is that it's continued to increase every single year. And depending on what metric you're looking at, I know Jake mentioned a couple, but there's several out there that you can measure this up against. It's all more and higher. And so it just proves that the government is really going after non-compliance. But I believe that the recoveries in 2022 were slightly less than 2023, but not too far off. With regards to the specialties, there's a handful, and I know we have a slide, I'm visualizing it in my head, that has the top 10. The majority of those specialties are, no surprise, likely to the audience, surgical specialties. Cardiology and orthopedic surgery are on that list, as well as neurosurgery. So the other common theme among those specialties is that they're highly paid and usually highly productive. So there is some trends there, I would say. Jake, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add on that, or I'll toss it over to you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think those are all good points. In my mind, the trend is just going to continue to keep going up as long as the government is making more money than they're spending on this. And right now, they're doing that in a fairly significant way. So I would expect this to continue to be a focal point.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Jake, although none of us have a crystal ball, right? Okay, unless we get any more questions from the audience, we only have one more, and that is, how is commercial reasonableness in the context of a healthcare transaction different from commercial reasonableness in the context of a traditional business transaction?
Yeah, I can take that. I think there's a lot of overlap, and the biggest difference is really in terms of healthcare being a much more highly regulated industry than a lot of other industries in which there's common business transactions, which is virtually all of them. In a transaction maybe outside of healthcare, it still has to meet the organization's needs. It still has to be strategic, which is a good starting place in healthcare. But in healthcare, you really have to take extra care to ensure that it's hitting all of those other topics that we touched on earlier. That it's meeting your patient needs, that it's there's no volume of referrals included, all of that type of stuff that kind of sets it apart from a typical business transaction.
Kate, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I totally agree. I think it's just heightened regulatory compliance that sets us apart. Those regulations that organizations have to comply with because they're in the healthcare space.
Okay, thank you both. Any final remarks tips, tricks you want to leave our listeners with today before we wrap up?
I'll go first. I would say, again, document, document, document. And also be careful what you document. Bad communication never goes away. And every single case that we've reviewed, there's quotations from board members and executives and even members of the physician compensation team that make its way into those cases. And the last thing you want to see at the end of the day is something you said, in a sidebar conversation for the world to see. So just again, document, but be careful and have legal counsel review that documentation.
Jake, how about you?
Yeah, Kate definitely took the words right out of my mouth. I know document was a focal point of our talk today, but I think just building the culture of compliance throughout the organization lessens the risk. And when everybody in the organization that's touching these physician contracts is thinking about commercial reasonableness, overall risk is going to be a lot lower. So just building that culture will help everybody out in the long run.
Allison, one final thought as Jake was talking, I thought of is, as Jake said, everyone should be aware of CR in the organization, but people leave organizations. People move to different organizations where it might not be as prevalent or as important, and new people come in. So I think an added layer of that is training and continued required training every year. You can't expect that the person who understood it and led the training is always going to be there in the organization. So make sure that it's a continued training and education element of your philosophy as well.
Such a good point, and something that we can be helpful with at ECG with our thought leadership and also with our experts. Thank you both again. That concludes today's program. Please note that if you, no one asked any more questions, so we're good to go there. But we would love to make you aware of ECG's extensive library of thought leadership that I just referred to. If you visit our website at www.ecgmc.com, you can learn more about these relevant and timely topics in healthcare. I would like to thank you again for attending our presentation. If you do have follow-up questions or comments for our experts, do not hesitate to contact one of us via the email that you've provided. And then one final reminder, we would greatly appreciate you taking a moment to complete the electronic survey upon exiting today's webinar. As I mentioned, our ECG will make a $5 donations to Doctors Without Borders for every survey that is completed. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.